Everything around the Pittsburgh Steelers just changed the moment Aaron Rodgers officially informed the organization that he is returning as the starting quarterback for the 2026 NFL season. And whether fans love the move or hate it, this decision tells you exactly where this franchise believes it stands right now. The Steelers are not rebuilding, they are not waiting for the future. They believe this roster can compete immediately, and the entire strategy behind bringing Rodgers back is centered around maximizing a championship window that they believe is still open. What makes this situation so fascinating is how divided Steelers Nation has been throughout this entire process. A lot of fans look at Rodgers and only see the age. They see a veteran quarterback entering another season late in his career, and they immediately question whether Pittsburgh is simply repeating the same short-term solution again instead of finally solving the quarterback position for the future. But internally, the Steelers clearly believe the context around Rodgers' last season matters more than the raw perception surrounding his age. When you really break down what happened during Rodgers' first year in Pittsburgh, the biggest issue was never simply the quarterback himself. The problem was the environment around him. Rodgers at this point in his career is no longer a quarterback who thrives outside of structure. He is not going to escape pressure consistently, extend plays endlessly, or beat defenses with mobility. Instead, he wins with intelligence, anticipation, pocket awareness, and arm talent. He operates similarly to how Tom Brady did late in his career, where the offense around him becomes absolutely critical to his success. And last season, the Steelers simply did not give Rodgers enough help at wide receiver. DK Metcalf was essentially the only legitimate starting level target defenses truly respected. Opponents constantly focused coverage toward him, and outside of Metcalf, nobody consistently won against man coverage. That completely changed the way Pittsburgh's offense had to operate. Rodgers was forced into shorter throws, quick reads, and conservative concepts because the Steelers lacked reliable separation downfield. The offense became heavily dependent on timing and yards after the catch because there simply were not enough explosive receiving options available. The numbers tell the story clearly. Outside of DK Metcalf, nobody in the receiver room even crossed 400 receiving yards during the season. Calvin Austin III finished as the second leading receiver with only 372 yards while missing time during the year. Roman Wilson struggled to establish himself consistently and finished with just 12 receptions for 166 yards. The production from the room simply was not good enough for a quarterback whose entire game now depends on structure and timing. And yet, despite all of that, Rodgers still managed to keep the offense functional. That is the part many fans overlook. Pittsburgh was not operating with an elite supporting cast offensively, yet the offense still hovered around league average efficiency metrics instead of collapsing entirely. Considering how limited the receiver room was, that becomes extremely important context when evaluating Rodgers' actual performance. He elevated a situation that realistically could have turned into one of the worst passing attacks in football. The comparison many people inside the Steelers community are now making is to Tom Brady's final season in New England before he joined Tampa Bay. Brady, at age 42, was surrounded by a weak receiving group outside of Julian Edelman and looked far less explosive statistically than he had earlier in his career. But once he arrived in Tampa Bay with Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Rob Gronkowski, Antonio Brown, and a stronger offensive structure, he immediately returned to elite form and eventually won a Super Bowl at age 43. The Steelers clearly believe Rodgers can experience a similar resurgence if the organization improves the situation around him. And honestly, Pittsburgh has already started moving aggressively in that direction. The hiring of Mike McCarthy as offensive play caller could end up becoming one of the most important moves of the offseason. Rodgers knows McCarthy's offensive system extremely well, especially the West Coast principles that Rodgers has always been comfortable operating within. The familiarity matters. Instead of forcing Rodgers to constantly adapt, the Steelers are building an offense around concepts he already understands at a high level. Then you look at the weapons Pittsburgh is trying to assemble around him. DK Metcalf remains the centerpiece of the receiving core, but the Steelers also added Michael Pittman Jr., giving Rodgers another legitimate target capable of winning physically and consistently moving the chains. Internally, there is also optimism that Roman Wilson can take a major step forward now that he is expected to play more naturally in the slot instead of being forced into uncomfortable situations last season. And the Steelers may not even be finished yet. There is still strong belief that Pittsburgh could continue adding more receiving help, potentially through younger players entering the system this year. Add in Pat Freiermuth at tight end, Darnell Washington's development, and Jaylen Warren's receiving ability out of the backfield, and suddenly Rodgers may have significantly more support than he had during his first season with the Steelers. That is why the organization remains confident. This is not about expecting Aaron Rodgers to suddenly become the MVP version of himself again. It is about creating an environment where his experience, intelligence, and efficiency can finally operate at the level Pittsburgh originally envisioned. The Steelers believe last year proved Rodgers could stabilize an offense under difficult circumstances. Now they want to see what happens if they actually surround him with enough talent to attack defenses properly. At the same time, the franchise is also trying to balance the future. The Steelers appear committed to a model similar to what Green Bay successfully used for decades. Let the veteran compete for championships while the next quarterback develops behind him. That philosophy worked when Rodgers learned behind Brett Favre, and later when Jordan Love developed behind Rodgers himself. Pittsburgh seems convinced that approach can work again here. And honestly, that may explain why the organization never panicked throughout this entire process. They were willing to wait for Rodgers because they believe he still gives them the best opportunity to win immediately, while also allowing the future quarterback to develop properly instead of being thrown into chaos too early. But now the biggest question becomes even more interesting for Steelers fans moving forward. If Aaron Rodgers is clearly the QB1 heading into 2026, who should truly be the quarterback developing behind him as the future of this franchise? That is where the entire conversation inside Pittsburgh becomes complicated, because while Aaron Rodgers returning completely changes the expectations for the 2026 season, it also creates one of the most important developmental situations this franchise has had in years. The Steelers are clearly trying to balance two timelines at once. They want to compete immediately with a veteran quarterback who still gives them stability, leadership, and experience, but they also understand the organization cannot afford to ignore the future forever. And honestly, when you look closely at the roster construction, you can already see the Steelers preparing for both scenarios simultaneously. The defense is built to win right now. Cam Hayward is approaching the final stages of his career. TJ Watt is still elite, but Pittsburgh understands players like him cannot remain in their absolute prime forever. Jalen Ramsey was brought in because the Steelers believe this defense still has championship-level potential if paired with consistent offensive football. Everything about the current roster screams urgency. This organization believes the window to compete is open right now, and that is exactly why they were willing to bring Rodgers back despite all the outside criticism. But while the defense pushes the team toward immediate contention, the quarterback room tells another story entirely. Because behind Rodgers, the Steelers are quietly trying to figure out who eventually becomes the next face of the franchise. There is already growing debate among fans about whether Mason Rudolph should remain the primary backup, or whether Pittsburgh should aggressively prioritize developing a younger quarterback immediately. And that conversation matters more now than it did a year ago, because Rodgers returning changes the pressure level for everybody behind him. Whoever sits in that QB2 role is no longer just a backup. That player becomes the potential successor learning inside a stable system. That is why names like Will Howard continue generating so much discussion internally among the fan base. The Steelers clearly value the idea of allowing a young quarterback to learn gradually instead of forcing immediate expectations onto him. Pittsburgh has watched organizations around the league destroy quarterback development by rushing prospects onto the field before they were truly ready. The Steelers appear determined not to repeat that mistake. Instead, they want patience. They want structure. They want the future quarterback learning from one of the smartest veteran passers in NFL history before eventually taking control of the offense himself. And Rodgers' presence could actually become extremely valuable for that process. No matter what people think about him personally, Aaron Rodgers remains one of the most intelligent quarterbacks the league has ever seen pre-snap. His understanding of protections, coverages, timing, route adjustments, and situational football is elite. Young quarterbacks sitting behind that type of experience can absorb enormous amounts of information without being exposed to immediate pressure on Sundays. That is exactly how Green Bay developed quarterbacks successfully for decades, and Pittsburgh clearly believes that same blueprint can work here. At the same time, Rodgers himself enters this season with something to prove. A lot of national criticism surrounding him focuses entirely on what he supposedly can no longer do physically. Critics constantly point toward the lack of mobility, the reduced improvisation, and the fact that he is entering another season in his 40s. But internally, the Steelers seem far more focused on what Rodgers still does exceptionally well. They believe his football IQ, processing speed, and ability to control games from the pocket remain extremely valuable, especially now that the supporting cast around him should be significantly stronger. And if Mike McCarthy's offense fully clicks early, this offense could look completely different from what fans watched last season. One of the biggest frustrations during Rodgers' first year was how difficult it became for Pittsburgh to consistently create explosive plays through the air. Too often, defenses crowded DK Metcalf because they simply did not fear the rest of the receiving core. That forced Rodgers into conservative decisions repeatedly, but now, with Michael Pittman Jr. added into the offense and additional receiving help potentially still arriving, defenses may finally be forced to respect multiple threats at the same time. That changes everything structurally. Suddenly, Rodgers may not have to force difficult throws into tight coverage constantly. The spacing improves, matchups improve, protection schemes become easier to manage because defenses cannot overload pressure toward one primary receiving threat every snap. And perhaps most importantly, the Steelers can finally operate the type of West Coast timing offense Rodgers has historically thrived within. That is a huge reason why there is legitimate optimism inside the organization despite all the outside skepticism. People forget just how difficult last season's offensive situation actually was. Pittsburgh did not have one of the weaker receiver rooms in the AFC. There is a real argument it was one of the weakest receiver groups in the entire NFL. Yet Rodgers still helped stabilize the offense enough to keep the Steelers competitive instead of allowing the unit to completely collapse. Now imagine if the surrounding talent finally matches the quarterback. That is the gamble Pittsburgh is making. The Steelers are betting that Rodgers does not need to carry the offense by himself anymore. They are betting that if they simply create the proper structure around him, he can still guide this team deep into the postseason while the younger quarterback quietly develops in the background. It is a strategy built on patience, experience, and immediate competitiveness all at the same time. And honestly, that makes the 2026 season one of the most fascinating years Pittsburgh has entered in a very long time, because this is no longer just about whether Aaron Rodgers can still play. It is about whether the Steelers finally built the correct environment around him to maximize what he still does best. If they did, Pittsburgh could legitimately surprise a lot of people this season, but if the offensive upgrades fail to deliver, the criticism surrounding this entire plan will only become